Hey there Unmaskers, welcome to my channel Unmask It Now. Thanks for tuning in today. In today's episode, we'll see how to join Amazon RDS for SQL Server to a self-managed Active Directory. This is a newly released feature for Amazon RDS for SQL Server. Let's look into the agenda for today's video. We'll first cover the Windows Authentication options that are available for Amazon RDS for SQL Server. We'll then look into the Windows Authentication options for Amazon RDS Custom for SQL Server. We'll look into the Management Instance and Amazon RDS Instance port requirements. For this demo, our domain is corp.local. We will launch the Management Instance and join it to the domain. And we will also install SQL Server Management Studio SSMS in this management server so that we can connect to Amazon RDS. In AD domain, we will create an organizational unit and we will use this to join the RDS DB instances to this organizational unit. We will then create an AD domain user for RDS Domain Join. We'll call that user RDS AD Join. We will delegate control to this AD domain user to perform domain join of the RDS DB instance. We will also create an AD domain user for SQL login, and we will call this user RDS user. From the AWS Management Console, we will create an AWS KMS key and then proceed to create a secret using AWS Secrets Manager, which is encrypted with that KMS key. We will then store the credentials for the RDS AD join in the secret. We will then proceed to create RDS for SQL Server DB instance and join it to the self-managed AD domain, and then configure SQL login for the AD domain user, that is RDS user. And finally, we'll review the setup. Let's now take a look at the Windows Authentication options that are available for Amazon RDS for SQL Server. Before the release of this feature that we're going to talk about today, it was not possible to directly join Amazon RDS for SQL Server to a self-managed Active Directory on Amazon EC2 or on-premises. It was, however, possible to join Amazon RDS SQL Server to AWS Managed Microsoft AD domain. If you needed to provide self-managed Active Directory users access to an Amazon RDS for SQL Server, you could do that by joining Amazon RDS for SQL Server to an AWS Managed Microsoft AD domain and then configuring a one-way or a two-way trust to your self-managed Active Directory. Let's take a look at the Windows Authentication options that are available for Amazon RDS Custom for SQL Server. Amazon RDS Custom for SQL Server works differently to Amazon RDS for SQL Server, wherein Amazon RDS Custom is a managed database service that permits customization of the underlying operating system and the database environment. Hence, it was always possible to directly join Amazon RDS Custom for SQL Server to an AWS Managed Microsoft AD or a self-managed AD on Amazon EC2 or on-premises when Amazon RDS for SQL Server could not. Since the release of the new feature, you can now directly join Amazon RDS for SQL Server to a self-managed Active Directory on Amazon EC2 or on-premises without requiring an AWS Managed Microsoft AD or configuring a forest trust between your AWS Managed Microsoft AD and your self-managed AD. There is a limitation that you'll need to know when using self-managed Active Directory for Amazon RDS for SQL Server. As of today, NTLM is the only supported authentication type, and Kerberos authentication is not supported with this method. If you need to use Kerberos authentication, you can use AWS Managed Microsoft AD instead of self-managed AD. It's also important to understand the other limitations with this setup. I will link the AWS public documentation in the description below. In today's demo, we won't look into setting up a self-managed Active Directory on-premises. Rather, we will set up a self-managed Active Directory on Amazon EC2 and then join the Amazon RDS for SQL Server to that self-managed Active Directory. With reference to the architecture for today's demo, for the purpose of this demo, we have covered the prerequisites in relation to the Active Directory setup in a previous video that I will link in the description below. You can also find the link at the top right corner appearing on your screen now. We will extend the previous architecture to now include a management server that will have SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS installed in order to connect to Amazon RDS for SQL Server. We will also configure the necessary security group for the resources created. Coming to the security group for the domain controller instances DC01 and DC02, which were covered in the previous video, we referred to the Microsoft documentation in the previous video to prepare the ports required for Active Directory. The AWS documentation link, however, that you see on the screen does define the minimum AD ports that are only required for Amazon RDS for SQL Server to join to the self-managed Active Directory. These ports are listed on your screen now. Based on that, the 3 rules that we created that you can see highlighted in red on the screen, they are optional for this setup as they are not required particularly to join Amazon RDS to self-managed AD. So for the purpose of this demo, I will remove these 3 rules just so you can see that even without these rules, you will be able to join an Amazon RDS SQL server to a self-managed directory, and that these rules are not necessary or have no impact for this setup. So you're free to have these rules removed, or you can keep it as is if you'd like. As for the outbound rules for ADSG, we will leave that untouched. Coming to the security group for the management server and RDS, let's take a look at the inbound and the outbound rules. For the management server security group, we will allow RDP traffic on TCP port 3389 from the Bastion security group. As for the outbound rules for the management security group, we will allow all traffic. For the inbound rules of the RDS security group, we will allow the MS SQL traffic on TCP port 1433 from the management security group. And for the outbound rules, we will allow all traffic. Switching to the AWS console, I am currently logged in as an administrator user Wiz in the Sydney region of my AWS account. As a prerequisite to today's video, we require the setup of a self-managed Active Directory domain that was covered in a previous video, which can be found on the link appearing right now at the top right corner of your screen. I will also leave a link in the description below. The previous video covered launching of a Bastion host in a public subnet to connect to instances in private subnet over RDP. We also launched 2 instances in private subnet, DC01 and DC02, and configured them to function as domain controllers for the self-managed AD domain, cop.local. Most of the commands in this video too will be run using PowerShell ISC, but I will leave a GitHub link to these commands in the description below. You can also use the UI instead of the PowerShell commands if you are more comfortable with that approach. I will explain the purpose of each command run as we go. To fast-track today's video, I have launched a management instance in the private subnet in AZA, and I've attached a security group management-sg to this instance. Let's quickly take a look at the rules. So the management server allows RDP traffic on port 3389 from the Bastion security group, and it allows all traffic outbound. I've also created another security group that we will be attaching when we create the RDS DB instance. Let's take a look at the RDS SG. For the inbound rules, we have allowed MS SQL traffic on TCP port 1433 from the SQL Server Management SG. And for the outbound rules, we have allowed all traffic. Switching over to the Windows machine, I'm connected to my Bastion host server. And on the Bastion host, I've also connected via RDP to the management server instance. So let me click on the management server instance and let's type the host name. You can see that I've renamed this Windows server with the host name MGMT to refer to this as the management server instance. Before we can join this machine to the Active Directory domain, let's configure the DNS server on this instance. To do so, we will use these commands. We will use the get netIP interface to get the interface index of our Ethernet to network interface, and we will then replace the interface index that we get and provide the server addresses. We will provide the DC01 and the DC02 IP addresses as the DNS servers on this machine before we can join it to the corp.local domain. So let me first run this command. As you can see, the interface index for Ethernet 2 is 7. So we will replace that in the command here. We will then obtain the IP address of the DC01 and DC02 instances. So switching back to the AWS console, I'm going to grab the IP address of DC01 and replace it here. And I'm going to do the same for the DC02 instance and replace it in the command. Now that that's done, I'm going to run the command to set the DNS server addresses on this instance. Let's now verify that that command has worked. To do so, I'm going to run ipconfig/all. And you can see that the DNS addresses are now set to the 2 DC IP addresses. Now that we've configured the DNS servers, we're now ready to join this instance to the domain. To do so, we will be using this command, add-computer. We'll provide the domain name. In our case, it's corp.local, and then it will prompt to perform a restart after joining it to the domain. So let's run this command. You can see that it's prompting us for the domain administrator credentials. So I'm going to provide that. Now that you've given the domain administrator credentials, you can see that the machine is restarting. I've given it a couple of minutes for the management instance to join to the Active Directory domain. So let me edit the properties of the RDP login for this instance. And I'm going to change the logon credentials and verify if we can log into the domain as a domain administrator. Now that I've entered the domain administrator credentials, I'm going to go ahead and connect to the instance. You can see that the RDP certificate provides the fully qualified domain name of the instance. That's management.corp.local. That gives us an indication that the machine is joined to the domain. So I'm going to click on yes. I'm now logged into the management instance and I've launched the Windows PowerShell IC session. Let's now verify that the machine has joined to the domain. So to do so, I'm going to run sysdm.cpl. You can see that the fully qualified domain name for the machine is MGMT and it has the domain suffix appended to it and the domain name is corp.local. Let's also verify the current user that we are logged in with. And you can see that we're logged in as the domain administrator, which is corp/administrator user. So this confirms that the management server instance has successfully joined to the corp.local domain. And we are also able to log into this instance as a domain administrator. We will come back to this instance when we have to install the SQL Server Management Studio tools. To perform the next set of instructions, I'm going to switch over to our AWS documentation. And then navigate to setting up of self-managed Active Directory. So we will go through all these steps in order to test Windows Authentication for Amazon RDS for SQL Server. So the first step is to create an organizational unit in your Active Directory. It is recommended to create a dedicated OU and service credential that is scoped for that OU, so that Amazon RDS for SQL Server DB Instance can be joined using those service credentials in that particular OU in your self-managed AD domain. By dedicating the specific OU and service credentials, we can try to avoid any conflicting permissions and we follow the principle of least privilege. So let's go ahead and log into one of the domain controllers and then go ahead and create an OU. So to do so, I'm going to follow these instructions, but do that on our domain controller. So flipping back to our Windows terminal, I'm going to log into one of the domain controllers, which is DC01, and then launch the AD users and computers console. So let's go ahead and create an organizational unit in this domain. To do so, I'm going to right click on the domain name and then click on organizational unit. I'm going to name the organizational unit as RDS, but you can give any name of your choice. I'm going to leave the protect container from accidental deletion option as checked and then go ahead and click on OK. So this covers creating an organizational unit in your Active Directory. We will use this OU later when creating the RDS and ensure that the RDS computer account will be joined and created in this particular OU in the domain. Let's now flip back to our instructions and go ahead and proceed to perform step number 2. In step number 2, we are going to create an AD domain user in our Active Directory. This will be the domain user where we'll be delegating control to only provide the least privileges in order to join the RDS instance to the domain. So let's go ahead and create this domain user and then delegate control on that particular OU with permissions specific for Active Directory Domain Join. So flipping back here, I'm going to go to the user's container, right click, create a new user. I'm going to name this user, provide a first name as RDS and the last name as AD join. So I can identify that this user is going to perform the RDS AD join. So I'm going to give the user logon name as RDS AD join. You can give any user logon name or the first name and last name of your choice. Let me go ahead and click on next. I'm going to uncheck the option user must change password at next logon and click on password never expires and then provide a password for this user. I'm going to confirm the password and then go ahead, click on next and then create this user. Now that the domain user is created, we will now perform the step 3 to delegate control to the AD user. To do so, I'm going to click on the OU that we created previously. right-click on it and click on Delegate Control. Click on Next and select the user that we created previously. With that user selected, I'm going to click on Next. I'm going to select Create a Custom Task to Delegate as defined in this instructions. I'm then going to select only the following objects in this folder and then select Computer Objects. And then select Create Selected Objects in the folder and Delete Selected Objects in this folder. Proceed to click on Next. In the permission section, we need to select General, validate right to DNS hostname, and validate right to service principal name. So we're going to scroll to the bottom and find those two options. You can see that you can find those options here. Click on Next and then click on Finish. Now that we've completed the activities on the domain controller, let's now flip to the AWS console to perform step number 4 to create an AWS KMS key. We're going to create the AWS KMS key, which is used to encrypt our AWS secret, which will contain the credentials for our RDS Domain Join user. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to flip to the AWS console and proceed to the KMS console. Following the instructions here, I'm going to create a key. The key type is symmetric and the key usage is encrypt and decrypt. Under the advanced options, the key material origin is KMS and the regionality will be the single region key. Let me click on Next and I'm going to provide an alias for this key. I'm going to call it RDS secret key and provide the same name in the description. I'm going to skip the tag section. For the key administrators, I'm going to give it permissions to the administrator user Wiz and allow the same user to also be able to delete the key when required. I'm going to click on Next. And for the key users, I'm also going to give the usage permissions to the administrator user Wiz. And I'm going to skip the other account section here. Coming to the key policy, we need to provide the RDS service permissions to decrypt any secret that is encrypted with this particular KMS key. So I'm going to add this permission statement in the key policy before creating the key. So under the key policy, I'm going to write one more statement and then paste these permissions. Once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and click on Finish. And you can see that our key is now created. Now that we have the key, let's go ahead and create our AWS secret that will store the credentials for the RDS DB Join user. So I'm going to flip to the Secrets Manager console. Click on Store a New Secret. I'm going to select the secret type as Other Type of Secret. And then for the key name, we're going to provide Customer Managed Active Directory username as described in the documentation. And for the password, the key name has to be Customer Managed Active Directory password. So we're going to use the same syntax for the two keys. The first one holds the username and the second one holds the password. So I'm going to provide the username for the user that we created called as RDS DB Join. I'm going to quickly verify that that's the user that we created. So you can see the account is RDS DB Join, and that's exactly what I provided here. And for the password, I'm going to provide the password that I gave when I created this user, which is password 1. For the encryption key, I'm going to provide the encryption key that we created previously to encrypt this particular secret, which is the RDS secret key. For the secret name, I'm going to call it RDS DB Join secret. Coming to the resource permissions, it is recommended that we attach the following policy to the secrets permission policy. So I'm going to quickly copy that and attach it in the resource permissions section. I do have to change the source account here and here, as well as the region where the key is created. So I'm going to copy that here, as well as here. And as for the region, we are in AP Southeast 2. Now that we have made those changes, I'm going to save this policy. and then proceed to click on Next. For configuration rotation settings, we need to keep the default values and then proceed to create the secret. I'm just going to verify the details and then proceed to store our secret. You can see that the RDS AD Join secret is now created. We will require the secret's ARN, which I will provide when creating the RDS DB instance. Before we can create the RDS DB instance, like I said before, there were 3 rules in the DC security group that we needed to remove just to verify that they don't have any impact in joining RDS to the self-managed AD. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and remove those rules. So switching to the EC2 console, I'm going to open the AD DC security group. The same security group is attached to both DC01 and DC02. These were the same 3 permissions that I'm going to remove as highlighted in red in my presentation earlier. Also referring to the AWS documentation. Under the network requirements, we can see that only these rules are required. So I'm going to remove those rules that are not required as part of the least privilege for joining RDS instances to the domain. So let me click here and edit the inbound rules. We do not require the rule for LDAP GC. We do not require the rule for LDAP GC SSL. And we do not require the rule for Windows time. So now that I've removed those rules, I'm going to go ahead and save those rules. So let me now switch over to the RDS console. Before we can create the RDS DB instance for SQL Server, let's first go ahead and create the database subnet group. So I'm going to click on the subnet groups on the left and then click on Create DB Subnet Group. I'm going to call this the RDS subnet group and provide the same name in the description. For the VPC, I'm going to select the corp VPC that we created. As for the subnets, I'm going to switch over to the VPC console and verify the availability zones where the private subnets are created. So let me switch over to the VPC console. I'm going to the subnets console. Let me filter with the corp VPC. I can see that the private subnets are created in AP Southeast 2A and 2B, and I have the subnet IDs, which is 11D9 and 3698. So I'm going to select those subnets. So 2A and 2B, and the private subnets are 11D9 and 3698. Now that we have selected the private subnets for our DB security group, I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. We're now ready to go ahead and create our Amazon RDS SQL Server database instance. So let me go ahead and create the database. I'm going to choose the standard create options as I do want to modify the VPC and our subnet group. I'm going to select the engine type as Microsoft SQL Server. The database management type is Amazon RDS. For the purpose of this demo, I'm going to just leave it as SQL Server Express Edition with the license include and the default engine version. I'm going to leave it as a dev test environment. I'm going to name the DB instance identifier as RDS SQL. I'm going to provide the master username, which is the admin user's master password, and confirm the same. Make sure you follow the constraints that are given when creating the password here. I'm going to leave the instance class as is, the storage as is. For the purpose of this demo, I do not require storage autoscaling, so I'm going to uncheck that option. I'm going to leave the default option for the compute resource and the network type. For the VPC, I'm going to select the corp VPC. For the subnet group, I'm going to select the RDS subnet group that I created. We do not require public access for the RDS instance, so I'm going to select no. For the firewall, I'm going to choose an existing security group that I created previously. So I'm going to select the RDS security group. For the availability zone, you could leave it as no preference, but I do want to create the RDS DB instance in the AP Southeast 2B in reference to my architecture diagram that I created previously. So I'm just going to go ahead and select that. I'm going to uncheck or leave the rest of the options as default here. This is the main section where we will be configuring the Microsoft SQL Server Windows Authentication and ensure that our RDS DB instances are joined to our self-managed AD domain. So let's go ahead and enable the Microsoft SQL Server Windows Authentication. Like I said before, you could use the AWS Managed Microsoft AD directory, but in this demo, we want to test out the new feature where we are joining RDS DB instances to a self-managed Microsoft AD directory. So I'm going to select that and provide all the details that are required so that the domain join is successful. The first one is the fully qualified domain name. In our example, our domain name is corp.local. As for the domain organizational unit, we created an OU called as RDS within our domain. So I'm going to provide the syntax as provided here for our OU followed by our domain name. So the syntax would be OU, which is the RDS OU that we created, and DC equals corp, and DC equals local. So this would be the syntax for the organizational unit, where you prefix it with OU equals to give the OU structure, and then you suffix it with the domain name that is prefixed with DC equals. So make sure you pay attention very closely to the OU and the DC parameters when defining the organizational unit structure. Here we will provide the ARN of the secret that contains the credentials to join the RDS instance to the domain. So let me go ahead and flip over to the Secrets Manager console and copy the ARN of the secret that we previously created. And then paste it in. For the primary DNS and secondary DNS, this would be the IP addresses of the DC01 and DC02 servers respectively, because they both function as the DNS servers for our domain. So let me go ahead to the EC2 console and grab the private IP addresses of our two domain controllers. So this completes the configuration for the SQL Server Windows Authentication section. Let's go ahead to the remaining parameters here. I do not require monitoring, so I'm going to uncheck it for the purpose of this demo. And for additional monitoring as well, I'm going to disable enhanced monitoring. I'm going to leave the rest of the options default and uncheck enable automatic backups. Now that all the parameters are set, I'm going to go ahead and create the DB instance. You can see that the DB instance takes a couple of minutes to launch, and while that's happening, you can monitor the status of the RDS DB instance creation. Currently, it's in the creating state. If I click on the DB instance identifier, if I scroll down to the connectivity and security section, you can see that it contains the details that we provided for Windows Server Authentication for the directory, and you can see that the directory status is pending join. We can also take a look at the logs and events that will be generated while the process happens. We'll come back and take a look at this later. While the RDS instance is being created and is being domain joined, I also want to point out that the documentation also covers how to troubleshoot in case the RDS instance fails to join to the self-managed Active Directory. You can see a couple of error codes that are listed here with its description and the cause and suggestions to troubleshoot these errors. It's also important to understand the self-managed Active Directory domain membership and the different status codes that you will see on the console for the directory status tab in the RDS console under connectivity and security. So make sure that you understand the status and also monitor what's the status when the DB instance is being joined to the domain. So while the DB instance is joined to the domain, let's go ahead and install the SQL Server Management tools on our management server instance. So let me flip back here. I'm going to switch over to the management instance. So now the management instance is created in a private subnet, so it does not have any inbound or outbound internet access. So I'm first going to install the SQL Server Management tools on the jump server or the Bastion host because it's launched in a public subnet, and then copy across the installer to the management server. So let me go ahead and just minimize the screen. So I'm currently on the Bastion host. So I'm going to open the browser and then click on the link to download the SQL Server Management Studio from the Microsoft documentation. You can find the installer here under the Download SSMS tab. So I'm going to download the installer. You can track the progress of the download, and once that's completed, we will copy across this executable to the management server instance. I can see that the download has completed. So let me go ahead and copy across the installer. So I'm going to copy across this installer to the management server instance. So connected to the management server instance, I'm going to just copy across that in the download section as well. So while the download is happening, we are going to use PowerShell commands to run the SSMS installer. So let's first get the file path for where the SSMS executable has been saved to, which is the download section. So I'm going to right click on the executable. So I'm going to right click on the executable and then copy the location where it has been saved and replace it in the file path here. We will also define the install path, which is in the system drive, which is the C drive here, and that will be copied into the folder SSMS2. And then we have certain parameters for running the installer. So we're going to run the install in quiet mode and install the SSMS utility in the install path specified. And then we're going to start the process by providing the media path and the arguments with the parameters list. Let me just go ahead and select this and then run it. The installation of SSMS will take a couple of minutes. If you do not want to use the PowerShell commands, you are more than welcome to right-click on the executable and run it, and then provide the different parameters as you are proceeding through the guide installation. While we are waiting on this, let's also switch over to the RDS console and check the progress on the RDS creation as well as its domain join. So let me go to the RDS console. I can see that the database status is still creating and the directory status is joining. Let's take a look at the logs and the events. We do not see any logs populated yet. You can now see that the process for installing the SSMS installer has completed. So let's just verify that the installation has completed by seeing the installer there. So you can see that the SSMS2 folder here. Let's go to Common, IDE, and if we search for SSMS.exe, we should be able to see the SSMS.exe here. So let me now flip over to the RDS console, and it says that the RDS instance is successfully created, and you can see that the status is available. But let me go down and verify the domain join status as well, and you can see that the RDS domain has successfully joined to the corp.local domain. So let's go back and verify what the domain join exactly did. We should be able to now see the RDS computer account in this particular OU. So let me flip back to one of the domain controllers. And if I take a look at the organizational unit and then refresh this page, you can now see that it contains the computer account for the RDS DB instance. Please do not make any changes to the computer account since RDS is a managed service and the domain join is automatically handled. If you do need to modify the OU for the RDS instance from this existing OU to another or perform any other domain operations, it is recommended to use the modify DB instance command from the RDS console. So let me quickly show you where you can do that. So you can select the database instance and then click on modify. While you can change a lot of other parameters, you also have the option to change any parameters related to the Microsoft SQL Server authentication. Once you've made those changes, you can then go ahead, click on continue, and then apply immediately or apply during the next maintenance window. Make sure that once you've done the modification and the modification is complete, any changes to the domain join of the RDS SQL Server will require a reboot of the DB instance. So I recommend that you do that. So now that we have joined the RDS instance to the domain, let's use SSMS from the management instance to connect to this RDS DB instance. So I'm first going to connect to the RDS DB instance by using the master username and password. And we'll be using SQL authentication to connect to it. So let me go back to the management server. I'm going to close this page. Then going to run SSMS from the start menu and launch the application. So now that the SQL Server Management Studio is launched, let's connect to the database engine. For the server name, I'm going to get the RDS endpoint. So going to the RDS console, I'm going to go ahead and click on the endpoint name and paste it here. Since we want to first test connectivity using SQL Server Authentication, I'm going to provide the master username and password that I provided when creating the RDS DB instance. You can see that we are now connected to the RDS DB instance with the master username and password. In order to test the Windows Server Authentication for RDS, we first need to create a domain user in Active Directory and then provide that user SQL Server login on the database. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to one of the domain controllers. I'm then going to create an RDS user that we will test the SQL Windows Authentication login for the SQL Server. So I'm going to go ahead and create a user. I'm going to call this RDS user. Click on next. I'm going to uncheck this and put on password never expires. And we'll create this user. Once creating this AD user, we now need to give access to this user in the SQL Server logins. So let me expand security. And you can see that under logins, we currently do not have the RDS user that was created in Active Directory. So we do need to provide access or revoke access to that user for SQL Server logins on the database instance. To get the commands for that, let me switch back to the AWS documentation and then copy across creating Windows Authentication SQL Server logins. And then I'm going to click on new query here and paste the query. So I'm going to use the master database and I'm going to provide the login for the user that I just created. So it's the corp user and the username is RDS user. I'm going to provide Windows Authentication for the default database master with the default language as English. So let's go ahead and run this query. Now that the query is run, I'm just going to quickly refresh the logins console. And you can now see that the RDS user in the corp domain has been added to a SQL Server logins on this page. Let's now see if we can try to log into the SQL Server database with this user. So I'm going to click on connect and click on the database engine. Keeping the RDS instance endpoint, I'm going to switch from the SQL Server Authentication to Windows Authentication. However, you see that you're not able to edit the username and password. This is because the Windows Authentication by default takes the username and credentials of the currently logged in user on the machine, which is our domain administrator. So if I run command prompt and if I type in who am I, you can see that we're currently logged in as the corp administrator. In order for us to log in to the database as the RDS user, we first need to log in to the management instance as a RDS user. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and launch the local user and administrator console, that is lusr mgr.msc, and then add the RDS user as a local administrator on this management instance. So I'm going to go ahead to groups, administrators, and I'm going to add the RDS user that we just created. I'm going to click on apply and then OK. Now that we have added the user, we now need to go ahead and log into the management instance as this user. So I'm going to close the console here. So let me sign out from the corp administrator user. I'm just going to right click properties and under logon credentials, I'm now going to provide the credentials of the RDS user. Let's now try to connect to the management instance as the RDS user. If I type in who am I, you can see that I'm currently logged in to the SQL management instance as the corp RDS user. Let's now launch the SQL Server Management Studio. Let's first connect to the SQL Server Authentication with the master username and password. So I'm going to grab the endpoint name. And like we did before, we are able to connect to the master user. But this time, let's go ahead and test if we can actually connect to the RDS user that we're logged in as using Windows Authentication. You can see with the endpoint as same and Windows Authentication, now you can see that it populates the username for the RDS user since we're logged into the management instance as that user. And it will use the currently logged in credentials to connect to the DB instance. So I'm going to go ahead and click on connect. And you can see now we are connected to the DB instance, both as the master user admin, as well as the RDS user, which is a domain user that we provided SQL Server login access on the database instance. Let's now go ahead and try a query. So I'm going to go ahead to this instance and then go ahead and click on new query. And I'm going to paste this query as you see here. And I'm then going to go ahead and execute. You can see that this query is run as the master user, which is admin. The net transport as well as the authentication scheme is TCP and SQL respectively, because we use SQL Server authentication. And you can see that the master user can run a query to list all the system databases. Let's go ahead and try the same query against the RDS user and take a look at the results. So I'm going to go ahead and click on new query. But this time I'm going to run it as the RDS user. You can see that I'm not able to run the second command. And the reason for that is because the RDS user does not have permissions to view the server state. So as the master user, let's go ahead and grant the permissions for the RDS user to view the server state. Switching back to the master user, if I go to the system databases and the master databases, if I go ahead and click on properties under permissions and then viewing the server permissions, I can see that the RDS user does not have permissions to view the server state. So you can check the box here and grant the permissions for the user. Alternatively, I'm going to give you a query that can be run as the master user to grant the view server state permissions for the RDS user. So let me minimize the screen. As the RDS master user, I'm going to give the corp RDS user server state permissions on the master database. So let me select this and then execute this query. You can see that the query completed. Let me now go to the properties of the master database and check the permissions. And I can now see that the RDS user has permissions to view the server state, and this was granted by the RDS admin, which is the master user. So now that the RDS user has the permissions, let's retry and see if it can now run the query. So let me go ahead and click on execute. And you can now see that the username that we're running this query with is the RDS user, which is a domain user in the corp domain. And it is important to notice that the authentication scheme is NTLM. And this is one of the limitations that I raised previously, that when you join RDS to a self-managed AD, the supported authentication protocol for SQL Server connections to Active Directory is always going to be NTLM, and the net transport is TCP. Kerberos authentication is not supported. And you can see that the user can also run a query to list all the system databases. So this concludes how to join an Amazon RDS for SQL Server to a self-managed Active Directory and also configure a domain user to provide SQL Server logins and operate against the database instance. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Unmask It Now. See you next time.